You don't have to look very hard to see that the first two Doom games, as well as their many ports and derivatives, have largely dominated coverage for the series for the past few decades. And rightfully so. The original Doom games are some of the most iconic gaming experiences available, but I would argue that while the third installment may not have been as iconic as the first two, it is still a great Doom experience, and something that I feel is in desperate need of more coverage and an official remaster. Welcome, my name's Dash, and welcome to another PC game retrospective. Now on the surface, it's easy to claim that 2004's Doom 3 borrowed a lot of concepts from 1998's Half-Life, a top-secret science facility, teleportation experiments, even a monorail connecting various parts of the facility. It's all here. However, we need to remember that Half-Life borrowed its fair share of concepts and mechanics from the first Doom entry, which arguably played a very pivotal role in its own success. Borrowing concepts and mechanics are fine, but the difference between being labelled as a clone and being known for something totally independent often comes down to how you improve these things and what else you add. Doom 3 not only evolves the mechanics from Half-Life, but in the process creates a whole new gameplay experience, for better and for worse. When Doom 3 first released, it was probably the first game that as a child I genuinely found scary, and for me it was the tipping point when video games became realistic enough to genuinely invoke fear in me. Now, I had obviously fallen for jump scares before, such as the kind found in Resident Evil, but Doom 3 was different. Its unique mixture of darkness, confined spaces, and really good audio design all worked together to make me feel genuinely uneasy.
The situation is out of control.
As an adult, I'm a little more emotionally robust, to the stage where I don't feel the same level of fear, but I still maintain that Doom 3 does a really good job of creating a fearful atmosphere. The version we're playing today is the Doom 3 BFG Edition. Now, there are a few changes from the original version of the game, but probably the most notable is the fact that you can now use a flashlight while holding a weapon, whereas before, the flashlight required you to unequip a weapon to use. Now, I know this change is not to everyone's taste, as there are people who think that this change negatively impacts the game. In my personal opinion, I think that without a doubt it changes the gameplay experience. Is it for better or worse? I can't really say. I've played through the game both with and without the flashlight change, and I didn't really enjoy either one more than the other. It's just a different experience. The BFG Edition is definitely a lot more fast-paced, however, at times this can clash with the level design, which is not really optimized for such pace. On the other hand, having the flashlight readily available did help me to appreciate some more of the level design by being able to see it easier. Ultimately, I am supportive of player choice, and I would encourage you to play and enjoy whatever version you think will suit your playstyle. Now, one of the interesting things about the version I played, which was part of Microsoft's Game Pass, was that upon downloading it, it refused to start. A quick Google search suggested that this is a common problem, with several suggestions on how to fix it. After trying several of the suggestions, the game still would not run, until I came across a post on Reddit that suggested changing the file name from Doom 3 to Doom 3 BFG. I thought to myself, clearly this is a joke. There's no way that this can be the actual solution. However, my disbelief quickly turned to relief when I implemented the change and the game booted. I have no idea on the technical element of how or why this is an issue, but alas, it solved my problem. Oh, and it's worth mentioning that Doom 3 did get a release for Xbox, which, considering the hardware on offer within that console, is impressive to say the least. The game was very well received, with most critics awarding it an 8 or a 9 out of 10, contributing to an overall Metacritic rating today of 87.
I'm afraid you'll get nothing more.
Which, interestingly, is a few points higher than the Doom 2016 reboot, which currently holds a Metacritic of 85. The story in Doom 3 is a relatively predictable, yet oddly engaging tale. The player assumes the role of an unnamed Marine who has just been transferred to the UAC Mars base. Upon arrival, the Marine is tasked with tracking down a missing scientist. However, shortly after locating him, things literally go to hell, with hordes of demonic creatures overrunning the base. The mission is simple: survive, and work to end the threat. There's a collection of cutscenes which help propel the narrative along with various logs which fill in more of the backstory. Overall, I wouldn't say you should expect Shakespeare here, but the overall narrative does suit the game well and helped keep me engaged to reach its conclusion. Before we continue, a massive thank you to those who support the channel. If you enjoy this type of content, please consider liking the video or subscribing to the channel. With that out of the way, let's put our helmet on, equalize an airlock, and head back to 2004 to remember Doom 3. While Doom 3 is without a doubt a first-person shooter at its core, I feel like there are definitely some survival horror elements here too, and while things like ammo and health are generally plentiful on all but the hardest difficulty, even on the lower difficulties, at times it certainly feels like a survival horror experience. Perhaps one of the biggest reasons the game nails the horror vibe is the environment. Doom 3's Mars UAC base feels exactly like I imagine a Mars UAC base would feel like. The corridors, the labs, the experiments, they all feel carefully curated by a development team that really wanted to nail the realism of the title. One of the things that really draws the player into the environment is the computer access systems. There's no press E to open a door or flick a switch. Everything from unlocking doors to venting toxic gas requires the interaction with an in-game computer terminal. On the surface, it's a small touch, but something which really pulls the player into the environment. It's also flawlessly consistent. In other games, there are particular segments which use a similar mechanic, but until Doom 3, I don't remember a title which used this mechanic all throughout the adventure. In terms of the basics of control and combat, both are good but very different to past Doom adventures, and this really calls back to my comments about the game being more of a survival horror title at times.
Okay, plan B.
Where the original Doom games were somewhat of a run-and-gun affair, Doom 3 demands a much more measured and deliberate approach to progression. This change in gameplay is supported by much more confined levels, with large open areas being a reasonably rare occurrence, and for the most part this works well. However, there are some moments in the gameplay where the enemy count exceeds what the environment can support. Add to this a really annoying screen shake when the player takes damage, and it's a recipe for frustration, although one that thankfully doesn't occur very often. The actual gunplay is also good, and like the level design, is curated to a slower paced experience, with things like reloading taking a lot longer than you might expect for a typical FPS game. The weapons also have mixed utility, requiring you to really think about how to approach a particular situation, with the shotgun doing exceedingly well at close range, but being virtually useless at range. Likewise, the machine gun, while effective at longer ranges, lacks the stopping power to be effective at close range, inviting the game's many enemies to engage you in melee combat. The player also has a melee ability, although this is practically useless unless you are supercharged by the game's Berserk power-up, which increases damage you do via melee dramatically. As far as the actual enemies go, there's a really good mix here between low, medium and high threat levels, with the game's slower moving zombie-like enemies serving as more an annoyance as opposed to some of the more mobile projectile firing enemies. Oh, and there's also a really nice touch in that whenever a new mainstream enemy is introduced, a short in-engine cutscene plays showcasing the enemy. It's a bit of forewarning for the player to expect something new, but it also serves as a way for the game to showcase some of the higher detailed textures used on the enemies. One of the things that helps Doom 3's pacing is a fairly well thought out objective system, with the player needing to work their way through a variety of environments to accomplish tasks to complete overall larger objectives. For example, at one stage in the game, you need to send a message in the communications area, only you find the door to communications is locked and requires an access code. Then when you do get the access code and access the communications area, you find out the actual communication system is damaged and requires you to explore other options. Another example sees the player blocked by a toxic gas leak, requiring them to track down the source of the leak and remove it. Under the covers, this is all really a giant fetch quest, but the game does a masterful job of blending these objectives into the gameplay, meaning that it never really feels old. There's also some limited branching paths within both the level design and story, and while they have limited impact on the overall plot progression, they are nice to see and offer the player some agency as to how they go about progressing through the game's roughly 12-hour campaign. Now, while I did enjoy my time with Doom 3, there are some minor things that I didn't enjoy. Firstly, there are a few mechanics in the game that are reused so many times that they start to lose impact. Teleporting in enemies is one of them. When Half-Life did this, it did so relatively sparingly, so when it happened, it was somewhat of a surprise and something that I think complemented the game's overall progression. In Doom 3, it's just far overused and really loses the overall impact it's going for. This is combined with a side mechanic where doors typically remain sealed until the teleported enemies are defeated. And look, I get what they were going for here, and at the start it certainly works, but after the 50th time this happens, it starts to get old. The other overused mechanic is that of opening a door and having an imp pounce on you. Again, it's a jump scare, and I get what the developers were going for, but when you combine the damage with the annoying screen shake, it can really get quite frustrating. The last point I'll make, and likely the most contentious, is the lack of lighting in the levels. And look, I get it, it's meant to be dark to create a foreboding atmosphere, but at times, I think the game is a little too dark to actually see where you need to go, and I feel the atmosphere still could have been created while giving the player a little bit more visibility into the actual environment. Overall though, Doom 3 is a very well curated gameplay experience. It's engaging, challenging, and most importantly, fun. Doom 3 has a very unique graphical presentation. It's a bit of a hybrid between realistic and stylized art, backed by very deliberate and thoughtful use of lighting and shadows. Honestly, when this game was released, I had never seen so many shadows in a game before, and for the most part, they all look really good. Performance at the time of release did scale quite well, and I remember running this at probably 20 to 25 frames per second on a fairly modest PC for the time. Obviously, in modern times, the game runs at a locked 60. However, it's good to reflect on the fact that upon initial release, it did scale quite well. Sound design is excellent also, with a very extensive voice dialogue component between the logs and the cutscenes, supported by very thoughtful ambient sounds and a soundtrack which feels right at home among the UAC base. Effects are likewise really good, with everything from the monsters to the weapons sounding impactful. Now, I said earlier that the game is in need of a remaster, and I want to unpack here a little about what I think could be changed for the better and help bring this game to a new audience. Firstly, I think there's an opportunity to upscale some of the art assets, particularly in the environment. While they look great for 2004, the level of detail does not hold up upon close inspection when compared to modern games. I think there's also an opportunity to tweak some of the enemy placement. Again, not so much of an issue for 2004, but for the overall flow of the game, I think some enemy asset placement could be tweaked. But probably the biggest and most impactful change I think could be made, and if I'm honest, I think this alone would be worthy of a remaster, is the introduction of ray tracing. While Doom 3's lighting and shadows look unique, they are in no way realistic, and I think this would be a nice middle ground for those who are for and those who are against the flashlight changes. What's more is that I think ray tracing could actually enhance the overall atmosphere, especially how some of the coloured lights would bleed into other areas. Now, whether or not we will see an official remaster anytime soon, or indeed anytime at all, is a question I don't have an answer for.
All they want is something to make them more money.
I do believe that there is a new audience that could be found with a remaster, as well as the opportunity to bring it to other platforms. Alas, no doubt there would be a fair amount of work required to make this a reality. As it stands alone, Doom 3 is still a great game. At times, I think its run-and-gun heritage hold it back from being a true masterpiece when compared to the more modern environments found in Doom 3, but on balance, it's still a remarkably solid game, and something that is still an easy recommendation to anyone who has a passing interest in first-person shooters. The entire Doom franchise has done a good job of evolving with time, with the 2016 reboot and subsequent sequel taking the game in a very different direction. It's difficult to see the developers going back to the Doom 3 formula, but I think that games like Resident Evil Village are proof that this formula can still work. But that's enough from me. Do you agree or disagree with my opinions? Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.